In the last minutes before 11 o'clock on the night of December 11th, 1942, the most powerful destroyer in the Japanese fleet was hunting nothing at all. She was called Teruzuki, 440 feet of new steel, 3 months old. 8 rapid-firing guns that could swing from sea to sky in seconds. On her bridge stood Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, 50 years old, the man the Americans could not stop, the man who had shattered a force of American cruisers 11 days earlier without losing a single ship. Waiting for him in the darkness were 3 boats made of wood. Not steel, wood. 2 layers of mahogany, glued and screwed, 40 tons apiece, carrying torpedoes so old they had been designed for the last World War. Torpedoes that ran too deep, or ran crooked, or simply refused to explode. The men who fired them knew all of this. They went anyway. Minutes later, the largest warship ever sunk by a boat like theirs was burning from the waterline up. But the torpedo did not kill Teruzuki. Something else did. Something the Japanese had loaded aboard themselves, and it was already waiting, 4 decks down, beneath the fire. Take a moment to settle in with a warm drink. Before we start, glance at the clock and tell us the time where you are. Then relax and enjoy another remarkable story from World War II. The island of Tulagi smelled like fuel and rot. It sat across the water from Guadalcanal, a scrap of jungle and coral that the United States Navy had turned into a base for the strangest weapon in the Pacific. There were no piers worth the name. There were no dry docks. There was a cove, a few tents, a fuel barge, and a scattering of small wooden boats tied up under camouflage netting, hidden from Japanese aircraft the way a man hides a knife under a coat. The men who lived there called themselves the Mosquito Fleet. It was a joke, and it was not entirely a joke. Their boats were 77 feet long. They weighed about 40 tons fully loaded, which is roughly the weight of a single gun turret on a real warship. They were built in New Jersey out of 2 layers of mahogany planking, laid crosswise and glued and fastened with bronze screws, because steel was needed elsewhere and because wood was light, and light meant fast. Fast was the entire theory. 3 Packard engines, marinized aircraft engines, 4,500 horsepower shoved into a hull you could put a rifle bullet through. Pushed the throttles forward and the boat climbed up onto her own bow wave and ran across the top of the sea at better than 40 knots, screaming like something being killed. Nothing in the Japanese Navy could catch her. Everything in the Japanese Navy could kill her. That was the arithmetic every man on Tulagi carried in his stomach. A destroyer's 5-inch shell would pass through one side of a patrol torpedo boat and out the other, and detonate somewhere in between, and the crew compartment would become a cloud of splinters and gasoline. There was no armor to stop it. There was nothing to stop it. There were 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel in tanks amidships, and aviation fuel does not burn the way diesel burns. It burns the way a match burns. The crews knew the fuel tanks by a name they had given them themselves, and the name was not funny. The Japanese had a name for the boats too. They did not call them mosquitoes. In the reports that went back to Rabaul and to Tokyo, in the mouths of destroyer captains who had spent months running the gauntlet of these waters in the dark, the boats had earned a different word: devil boats. Things that came out of nothing hit and were gone before the searchlights could find the water where they had been. It was a name that suggested the boats were dangerous. The truth, in December of 1942, was that they had never sunk anything that mattered. That was the ugly, quiet fact underneath the whole enterprise. For 3 months, the patrol torpedo boats had been going out into the Sound between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, night after night, throwing themselves at Japanese destroyer columns. They had made dozens of attacks. They had claimed hits. Some of those claims were probably true. Almost none of them could be proven. And in Washington and in Pearl Harbor, senior officers had begun to ask the question out loud: whether wooden boats belonged in a modern naval war at all, whether the fuel and the men and the shipping space were buying anything except noise. The men on Tulagi did not need to read those memoranda. They could feel the question every time they came back at dawn with empty tubes and nothing to show. And the tubes were the worst of it. Each boat carried 4 torpedoes, and the torpedo was a Mark 8. The Mark 8 had been designed before the previous World War. It was old enough to have grandchildren. It was 21 feet long, it weighed nearly 1.5 tons, and it carried a warhead heavy enough to break a destroyer's back if it arrived in the right place at the right depth with a working detonator. It very often did not. The Mark 8 ran deep when it was supposed to run shallow. It ran shallow when it was supposed to run deep, and then it broached, and then it left a bright phosphorescent scar across the surface of the sea that told every lookout on every enemy ship exactly where the boat that fired it was sitting. Its gyroscopes drifted. Its firing mechanism stuck. Men who had spent the war maintaining these weapons in tropical heat, in engine rooms that ran to 130 degrees, would tell you privately that when you pressed the button, you were not launching a weapon. You were making a request. Every man who went out on those boats understood that the thing he was betting his life on would probably not work. They went out anyway. That is the part that does not fit into a diagram of a naval battle, and it is the only part that actually explains what happened on the night of December 11th. One of the boats tied up in that cove was PT-37. She had been built by the Electric Boat Company at Bayonne, New Jersey, and she had gone into service in the summer of 1941, which made her a veteran by the standards of that war. There were 11 men aboard her, motor machinists' mates who kept 3 temperamental aircraft engines alive on salt air and bad fuel, torpedo men who serviced weapons they did not trust, gunners who worked twin 50 caliber machine guns that jammed when the spray got into them, which was always. One of the machinist's mates was named Eldon Genter. Remember the name. It will not matter for another 7 weeks, and then it will matter more than anything else in this story. Her skipper was Lieutenant Lester Gamble. Gamble was not a product of Annapolis. He was a reserve officer, a civilian the Navy had put into a uniform and then handed a boat, which was true of most of the men in the Mosquito fleet, and which is worth remembering, because the man who was about to sink the largest warship ever destroyed by a boat like this was not a professional naval officer. He was somebody's neighbor. He had learned this trade in the dark, in these waters, by surviving it. Across the Sound, everything was different. Terazuki had been completed on the last day of August 1942 in a Japanese shipyard, and she was, by a considerable margin, the finest destroyer the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever put to sea. She belonged to a new class, the Akizuki class, and she was not really a destroyer in the ordinary sense at all. She was something the Japanese had built because American aircraft were killing their ships, and she had been designed to kill aircraft. 440 feet from stem to stern, 2,700 tons, more than 3,000 when she was loaded. 33 knots, and her guns were the point of her, 4 twin mounts carrying 8 of the new 100mm dual-purpose weapons, guns that could be laid flat at a ship on the horizon or cranked up to the vertical at a dive bomber falling out of the sun, guns that fired faster and reloaded faster than anything else in the fleet. She had a crew of well over 350 men that night, because she was not only a warship, she was a flagship. The admiral whose flag she carried was Raizo Tanaka. He was 50 years old. He had spent his career in destroyers, which in the Japanese Navy was not the road to glory, and he had turned that into a kind of mastery that the Americans had learned to fear by name. His squadron ran the supply route down the chain of islands to Guadalcanal so regularly and so successfully, and always at night, that American sailors had given the operation a name of its own, the Tokyo Express. 11 days before, off a place called Tassafaronga, an American force of cruisers had ambushed Tanaka in the dark with radar, which he did not have, and with numbers, which he did not have either. He had turned into them and fired torpedoes. When the shooting stopped, 1 American heavy cruiser was on the bottom, and 3 more were wrecked. He lost 1 destroyer. That was the man on Terazuki's bridge. That was the ship under his feet. And on the night of December 11th, both of them were doing something that had nothing to do with glory. They were delivering food. the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were starving. Not hungry, starving. In the clinical sense, dying of it in the jungle. So weak that a man who lay down often did not stand up. The Americans had taken the airfield, and the airfield meant that no Japanese transport ship could reach the island and live. So the Imperial Navy had reduced its greatest destroyer squadron to a delivery service. They filled steel drums with rice and ammunition, sealed them, lashed them to the decks of warships, ran south at night at high speed, cut them loose in the water off the coast, and ran north again before dawn brought the American dive bombers. The current was supposed to carry the drums to the beach. 11 destroyers went south that night. 5 of them carried the drums. The rest, Terazuki among them, went along to protect them. They reached the water off Cape Esperance, and they put 1,200 drums into the sea, on schedule, exactly as planned, and then Tanaka turned his column north and began the run for home. It was almost 11 o'clock at night. The sea was flat, so flat that the wakes of the destroyers lay behind them like long, pale scars that took a very long time to heal. There was no moon. The cloud cover had swallowed the stars, and there was no horizon anywhere, no line between the black water and the black sky, nothing at all for a lookout to see. The 11 ships moved through that absolute darkness at low speed in a long column, each ship 300 yards behind the one ahead of it, holding station by instinct and by the faintest smudge of a shape in front. Ahead of them, sitting silent with engines idling in the black water, 3 wooden boats were waiting, and on the nearest of them a reserve lieutenant put his hand on the throttles. Lester Gamble was watching a shape. That was all he had. There was no radar on PT-37. There was no sonar. There was no fire control computer, no gyroscopic director, no instrument of any kind that could tell him how far away the enemy was, or how fast he was moving. There was a pair of binoculars, a stopwatch, and the accumulated experience of men who had done this before in these same waters, and had come home. The shape was blacker than the night behind it. That was how you found a destroyer with the naked eye. You did not look for a ship. You looked for a place where the darkness was more solid than the rest of the darkness, and then you watched that place until it moved. It was moving, slowly. The Japanese column was making perhaps 12 knots, which sounds like nothing, and was in fact a great deal, because a destroyer at 12 knots was still faster than a wooden boat trying to turn. Gamble had his engines at idle. So did the 2 boats behind him, PT-40 under Lieutenant Stilly Taylor and PT-48 under Lieutenant Bill Kreiner. 3 boats, drifting, silent, invisible. At idle, a patrol torpedo boat left no wake at all. Pushed the throttles and she left a glowing trail of disturbed plankton behind her, a phosphorescent line drawn across the black water like a finger pointing back at her, and every Japanese lookout in the Solomon Islands had been trained to look for exactly that. So they drifted, and the destroyers came on, and the range closed. The torpedo tubes on a boat like this were bolted to the deck at a fixed angle, canted outward from the center line. They did not traverse, they did not train. You could not aim a torpedo from a patrol torpedo boat. You aimed the boat. You pointed the entire hull at a place in the water where the enemy was going to be about a minute from now, and you fired, and then the arithmetic was out of your hands forever. The problem was that to do it with any hope at all, you had to get close. Not close in the sense that a cruiser is close when it opens fire at 15,000 yards. Close in the sense of a knife fight, under 1,000 yards. Well inside the range of every weapon on that destroyer, inside the range of her searchlights, inside the range of the 25mm mounts that could saw a wooden boat in half in about 4 seconds, if anyone aboard her thought to look in the right direction. Gamble pushed the throttles forward. The Packards came up out of idle with a low, ugly rumble that he could feel through the deck and through his boots and through his knees. Not full power, nowhere near it, just enough to move, because full power meant noise, and noise meant death. PT-37 began to slide forward through the flat black water, and behind her, Taylor and Kreiner followed. The shape grew. It stopped being a smudge and started being a ship. Gamble could see the line of her, the low forward deck, the rise of the bridge structure, the mast standing up against a sky that was only marginally less black than she was. She was in the column ahead of him. He did not know her name. He did not know that she was 3 months old, that she was the finest destroyer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, that she carried an admiral, that she was the reason the Tokyo Express had never stopped running. He knew she was the biggest thing out there. That was the entire targeting doctrine of the Mosquito fleet, reduced to a sentence. Find the biggest one, get close, fire everything, leave. At something under 1,000 yards, he turned. He put the wheel over to port and brought the bow of PT-37 around until the fixed tubes were pointing at a patch of empty sea. A patch of sea where a 440-foot destroyer would arrive in about a minute if she held her course and her speed, and if Gamble's estimate of that course and that speed, made by eye, in the dark, at a range he could only guess at, happened to be correct. He put his thumb on the firing key. There were 10 other men on that boat with him, and none of them could do anything at all. That is the part of a torpedo attack nobody puts in the paintings. For the man at the wheel there is at least the illusion of control, the throttles, the compass, the decision. For everyone else there is only the waiting. Down in the engine spaces, in a compartment with no view of anything, with 3 Packard engines idling on either side of him and the whole hull vibrating like a struck bell, a motor machinist's mate named Eldon Genter was standing in the dark in a boat that had closed to knife range with a destroyer, and he could not see the destroyer, and he could not see the sea, and he could do nothing but keep the engines alive and listen. That was the deal. That was what those men had agreed to when they volunteered for a service that did not exist 10 years earlier and that half the admirals in the United States Navy thought was a waste of good gasoline. You went into the dark. You got close enough that missing was not really possible and neither was surviving a mistake. And most of you spent the worst 90 seconds of your life staring at a piece of plywood 18 inches from your face. Gamble fired tubes 1 and 2. 2 flat cracks of compressed air, felt more than heard. The boat shuddered and lightened as the better part of 1.5 tons of steel went over the side and into the water. Then tubes 3 and 4. 2 more. 4 torpedoes gone. The whole magazine, everything he had, all of it now running blind through black water toward a place where a ship might or might not be in 50 seconds. He did not wait to see. That was doctrine too, and it was doctrine written in the blood of men who had waited. Gamble spun the wheel hard to starboard and slammed the throttles all the way forward, and the 3 Packard engines went from a rumble to a scream, and PT-37 came up onto her bow wave and began to run. Behind him, in the same handful of seconds, Taylor and Kreiner fired too. 12 torpedoes in the water, 3 wooden boats running east at 40 knots with empty tubes, trailing 3 long phosphorescent scars across Iron Bottom Sound, 3 fingers pointing straight back at them for anyone who cared to look. Nobody looked. That is the thing that is almost impossible to believe, and it is exactly what the Japanese records say. There was no alarm, there were no searchlights, there was no gunfire. 11 destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the finest night-fighting force in the world, the ships that had humiliated the American Navy in these waters again and again for 6 months, steamed placidly north in perfect formation, while a dozen torpedoes ran toward them through the dark. Gamble counted in his head. The crew of PT-37 counted with him, silently, each man in his own way, hunched behind whatever thin piece of mahogany was nearest to him, which would stop nothing at all and which they held on to anyway. 40 seconds. 30. Most of those torpedoes were already dead. Some had gone deep and were passing harmlessly beneath the enemy's keels. Some had wandered off their gyro settings and were running away into the open sea to sink somewhere and be forgotten. That was the Mark 8. That was what it did. That was what it had always done. 20 seconds. 10. 2 of them were still running true. At 2 minutes before 11 o'clock, the world came apart. The first torpedo struck Teruzuki on the port side aft, and it struck her in the worst possible place, in the after engine room, directly beneath the mainmast. It went in below the waterline through steel plating that had never been designed to stop a weapon arriving at that depth from that angle at that range, and it detonated inside the ship. The second one hit her in the stern. It smashed the port propeller. It tore the rudder off its mounting. In the space of a heartbeat, one of the most advanced warships in the world stopped being a warship at all. She could not steer. She could not drive. The after engine room, the compartment where the propulsion machinery converged, where the fuel lines ran, filled with fire, and then with the sea. Her after oil tanks ruptured and the oil caught, and it came out of her and spread across the surface of Iron Bottom Sound and burned there, so that the ship was now sitting in the middle of a lake of flame that she herself had made. On the bridge, the blast picked up Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka and threw him. He went across the compartment and his head struck metal, and he went down and did not get up. The master of night operations, the man who had broken an American cruiser force 2 weeks earlier, was lying unconscious and bleeding on the deck of his own flagship, and the ship was burning, and the men around him were shouting into the dark. Miles to the east, Gamble saw it. A column of water and fire went up behind the destroyer's mainmast, and for a moment the entire Sound was lit, and in that moment Gamble could see the whole thing with a terrible clarity. The shape of the ship, the shape of the flame, the specks that were men. Then the light of it kept on going, and it did not stop, because the oil was burning now, and the oil would burn for hours. The Japanese response should have taken about 90 seconds. It took 9 minutes. At 8 minutes past 11, the escorting destroyers finally opened fire, and this is the detail that gets left out of most tellings, and it is the most extraordinary thing that happened that night. They were firing at nothing. They were firing into empty ocean, into open water, at shadows and at guesses, and they were doing it because they could not see. They had been steaming in absolute darkness for hours. Every man on every bridge and every lookout in every gun tub had eyes adapted to that darkness, pupils wide open, straining at a black sea, and then the largest ship in the formation had turned into a bonfire in the middle of them. Night vision does not survive that. It is a physiological fact, and it is not negotiable. A man who has been staring into pitch darkness and is suddenly shown a fire is blind afterward, and he stays blind for many minutes, and there is nothing whatever he can do about it. The Japanese fleet was blinded by its own flagship. Their searchlights swept the water in wide, useless arcs. One beam went across the sea a few dozen yards ahead of PT-37, close enough that every man aboard her stopped breathing, and then it swung away and kept going and found nothing, because the man behind it was looking for a boat in the dark, with eyes that had just been ruined by a burning ship. Star shells burst overhead. Parachute flares came down slowly, lighting the sea from above, throwing enormous swinging shadows across the water. The guns of the escorts hammered away at the empty places where the flares said something might be. The 3 boats that had actually done it were already gone, running east at full throttle, engines redlined, hulls slamming from wave to wave hard enough to loosen a man's teeth in his head. 4 miles to the north, 2 more boats had heard the explosion. Frank Freeland in PT-44 and Charlie Tilden in PT-110 had been patrolling off Kamimbo Bay when the word came over the radio, and the sky to the south went orange. They turned toward it. They ran toward the fire. What happened when they got there is not something the records agree on, and so it is not something this story is going to claim. What is certain is this: no second torpedo ever hit Terazuki. Nobody needed to fire one. She was already dead. She simply had not been told yet. Aboard the destroyer, the fight had begun. Command had fallen to Commander Orita Tsuneo, her captain, because the admiral was unconscious and being carried, and because a captain does not get to be shocked. He got the damage reports as they came, and they came fast, and each one was worse than the last. The after engine room was gone, flooded, on fire, or both. The port shaft was broken, and pieces of it had torn holes in the hull on their way out. The rudder was simply not there anymore. The pumps were running, and the water was coming in faster than the pumps could move it. She was down by the stern and getting lower. The fires were the immediate problem. Burning fuel oil is not like burning wood. It cannot be beaten out. It runs. It finds the low places. It goes down ladderways and along cable runs and into compartments that were supposed to be safe, and it takes the air out of them, and it kills the men in them long before the flames arrive. The damage control parties went aft into that with hoses, in the dark, in a ship that had lost her power aft, on decks that were already hot enough through the soles of their boots to be an argument for turning back. They did not turn back. They fought it for hours. They fought it well, and this must be said plainly, because it is easy to tell a story like this as though the enemy simply collapsed. They did not collapse. The crew of Terazuki fought for their ship with a discipline that any navy in the world would have been proud of, and at several points during that night, it looked as though they were going to win. Consider what that fight actually was. The lights aft were gone, so they worked by the light of the thing they were trying to kill. The deck plating under them was hot enough to blister a hand laid flat on it, and it got hotter as the night went on, so that men were standing on a floor that was slowly cooking them through their boots while they aimed a hose into a wall of orange. The air was thick with oil smoke, the kind that coats the inside of a man's throat and stays there, and the ventilation had failed with the machinery, so there was nowhere for any of it to go. They breathed it. They kept breathing it. Below them, in compartments that had already flooded, there were men who were not coming out. 9 of Terazuki's crew died that night, and almost all of them died in the first few seconds, killed by the blast itself, or trapped in spaces that filled with water in the time it takes to understand that something has gone wrong. The men fighting the fire on the deck above knew that. They knew what was under their feet. They kept working, because the alternative was to lose the ship and everyone else on her, and because they were sailors of a navy that did not have a word for stopping. Hose teams went aft and came back and went aft again. Officers moved along the passageways, counting heads, sealing hatches, making the small, terrible arithmetic of damage control, which is the arithmetic of deciding which compartments to give up in order to keep the others. Somewhere in the forward part of the ship, men who could hear all of it and see none of it stood at their stations and waited for orders, which is its own kind of courage and gets no medals in any country. For a while, they were gaining, because Terazuki was not sinking. That is the second thing about this night that nobody expects. The torpedo did not sink her. 2 torpedoes from an American patrol boat hit the finest destroyer in the Japanese fleet, and they crippled her, and they set her on fire, and they did not sink her. Her hull forward was intact. 2/3 of the ship was undamaged. Her forward guns still worked. If the fires could be contained, she could be taken in tow. She could be dragged north to Rabaul or to Truk, and she could be repaired, and she could come back. And every hour that her crew held the fire was an hour that possibility stayed alive. At 33 minutes past 11, they took the admiral off. The destroyer Naganami came alongside a burning ship, which is one of the more dangerous things a ship can be asked to do, and they passed Rear Admiral Tanaka across the gap between the 2 hulls. He was still unconscious. There was blood on his head. Behind him went his staff, the officers and the signalmen and the communications specialists, the machinery of command that a destroyer squadron cannot function without, 57 men in all, lifted off a flagship that was on fire and might explode at any moment. He never saw his flagship again from her own deck. He had chosen her because she was the best ship in the fleet, and the last time he stood on her he was being carried, and he was not awake for it. Arashi came up on the other side and began to pump water. She had come out of the column and put herself against a burning hull with her own magazines full and her own crew standing on her own deck, and she stayed there, and nobody aboard her had to be told what would happen to them if the fire won. 2 destroyers, bow to bow with a burning third, in the middle of Iron Bottom Sound, in the dark, in waters they knew were full of American boats. They stayed. They stayed for hours. And the whole time, 4 decks down, underneath the fire, the thing that was actually going to kill Terazuki was sitting exactly where the Japanese Navy had put it. She was a warship built to fight aircraft, but she carried depth charges too, because every destroyer did. They were stowed aft, in the magazine, in the stern of the ship, and the stern of the ship was the part that was on fire. Depth charges are not shells. A shell is designed to be safe until it is fired. A depth charge is a steel drum packed full of high explosive, designed to sit in the water and detonate from pressure or from a timer, and it is one of the least sophisticated objects on a warship and one of the most dangerous. Heat them long enough, and they do not need a fuse. Heat them long enough, and they will do it on their own. The fire in the after section was working its way toward them. The men fighting it knew what was underneath them. They knew what the after magazine held. They kept fighting anyway, and that is either the bravest thing in this story or the most futile. And the truth is that it was both at once. At some point during those hours, the ammunition for the light guns began to cook off. Small explosions, popping in the flames, sending tracer rounds skidding in random directions across the deck like sparks off a grinding wheel. The after gun mounts had been abandoned. They were too close to the fire and too hot to man. The forward mounts were still fully operational and had nothing whatsoever to shoot at. The pumps kept losing. The stern kept settling. And Commander Orita Tsuneo, standing on the bridge of a ship that would not sink and could not be saved, with more than 350 men aboard her and a magazine full of depth charges cooking under a fire he could not stop, was running out of the only thing he actually needed: time. At 1:15 in the morning, Commander Orita Tsuneo gave the order that no captain ever wants to give and that every captain rehearses in his mind for his entire career. He ordered the Kingston valves opened. The Kingston valves are the openings through which the sea is deliberately let into a ship. Orita was ordering his men to drown Terazuki, not the Americans, not the torpedoes, him. He was going to kill his own ship with his own hands, and he was going to do it in a controlled way, on his own terms, at a speed he could choose. He did it to save the crew, because the fire was going to reach the depth charges. He could not stop that anymore. The pumps were losing, the flames were working aft and down, and when that magazine went, the entire stern of Terazuki would cease to exist, and it would take every man still aboard her with it, and it would probably take the 2 destroyers standing alongside her as well. If instead the sea came in slowly, from below, then the ship would go down and the men would have time to get off her, and the fire would go out the only way it could. He was trading a warship for 350 lives, and he made the trade without hesitating, and it worked. They abandoned her in the dark. 140 men crossed to Arashi. 57 had already gone to Naganami with the unconscious admiral. And 156 men went over the side into boats and pointed them south, toward Guadalcanal, a few miles away across the Black Water, toward an island held by the United States Marine Corps, because a prisoner of war camp is survivable and a magazine explosion is not. Some of them made it to the beach. Some of them were captured there, and lived, and went home years later. 9 men did not leave the ship. They had died in the first seconds, in the blast or in the flooding, and they are still there. By the small hours of the morning, Terazuki was empty. The fires burned unchecked now, with nobody left to fight them, spreading forward through compartments where nothing was moving. She was down by the stern and her bow was rising slowly out of the sea, and she was lit up like a torch in the middle of Iron Bottom Sound, visible for miles in every direction, a beacon marking the exact position where the Imperial Japanese Navy had just lost the best destroyer it had. At 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, on the 12th of December, the fire reached the after magazine. The depth charges went off. They went off together, all at once, and the stern of Terazuki was simply deleted from the world, not damaged, not broken open, gone. A ship built to hunt American submarines was destroyed by the weapons she carried to hunt them with, and the last thing the Imperial Japanese Navy did to Terazuki was load her. What was left of her rolled and went under and took the fire down with her, and Iron Bottom Sound was dark again, and it was quiet. Raizo Tanaka woke up on a ship that was not his. They told him what had happened. He had a concussion and a wound on his head, and he was on the bridge of the Naganami, and somewhere behind him in the dark, his flagship was on the bottom. He had run the Tokyo Express for 6 months. He had beaten the Americans in the one-night battle where they had every advantage and he had none, and he had lost his ship to a boat made of wood while carrying rice. His career at sea ended there. He never commanded ships in combat again. He was sent to Burma, to a shore assignment, for the rest of the war, and the destroyer squadrons of the Solomon Islands were handed to other men who were competent and careful and who were not him. Years later, after everything, Tanaka wrote about Guadalcanal in an American naval journal. He did not write about heroism. He wrote that Japan had bled itself to death holding an island it should have let go, and that everyone who mattered had been able to see it, and that nobody had been willing to say it. And there is one more number in this story, and it is the one that hurts. That night, the 11 destroyers of Tanaka's force put 1,200 supply drums into the sea off Cape Esperance. 1,200 drums of rice and ammunition for men in the jungle who were dying of hunger. The Japanese army recovered 220. The rest drifted away, or sank, or washed up where nobody could get to them, or were simply never recovered at all. Less than 1 drum in 5 ever reached a starving soldier. The entire operation had already failed before Gamble ever pressed the firing key. Japan gave up the finest destroyer in her fleet, and the career of her best destroyer admiral, and 9 sailors, to deliver a fifth of a load of rice to an island she would abandon 8 weeks later. That is what the Tokyo Express had become by December of 1942. Not a supply line. A funeral procession that had not yet admitted what it was carrying. In February, the Japanese took their soldiers off Guadalcanal in the dark and called it a withdrawal, and it was the first great defeat of the Pacific War. For the Americans, the meaning of that night was immediate and enormous. Teruzuki remains to this day the largest warship ever sunk by a patrol torpedo boat in the Second World War. Not one of the largest. The largest. Every argument in Washington about whether wooden boats were worth the fuel had just been answered by 3 reserve officers and about 30 enlisted men in a cove on Tulagi. The Mosquito fleet stayed. More boats came. More crews came. Lester Gamble was given the Navy Cross. He would go on to command a squadron of these boats through the end of the war, and he would survive it, and he would go home. When people asked him about the night he sank Tanaka's flagship, he did not tell it the way it gets told. He talked about the other boats. He talked about the crew. And he talked, mostly, about luck, about how the torpedoes had run straight for once, about how the Japanese had not seen them, about how they got away with it. He was right. 3 boats fired 12 torpedoes and 2 of them worked. Even in triumph, 10 of those weapons did exactly what the Mark 8 always did. And 2 of the boats that fired them are worth one last word. Stilly Taylor's PT-40 put a torpedo into Teruzuki that night, alongside Gamble's. Bill Kreiner's PT-48 fired 2, and claimed a hit, and believed it. The Japanese records show only 2 torpedoes struck the ship. Kreiner ran his boat in against a destroyer column in the dark, launched everything he had, and missed, and there is no sign that anyone ever told him otherwise. That is not a footnote. That is what the fight was actually like. And then there is PT-37. 7 weeks later, on the 1st of February 1943, she was out again, northwest of Cape Esperance, in the same black water. Lester Gamble was not aboard her. She had a different skipper now, a young ensign named James Kelly, and she was doing what she had always done, running at a Japanese destroyer column in the dark, with 4 torpedoes and no armor. The Japanese destroyer Kawakaze found her first. A shell hit PT-37 in the gasoline tanks. 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel went up at once. The boat did not sink. There was nothing left to sink. 77 feet of mahogany and plywood, and her crew with her, were converted into fire and splinters in the space of about a second, and the pieces came down into Iron Bottom Sound, and the sound closed over them. One man came out of the water alive. He was a motor machinist's mate. He was badly wounded. He spent more than 3 hours in the sea in the dark, holding on, with sharks in the water around him, and he was picked up, and he lived. His name was Eldon Genter. The boat that killed the largest warship ever sunk by a boat like her did not last 2 months. The men who crewed her on the night she made history were, most of them, dead before the spring. And the officer who had commanded her that night, the one who got the medal, was somewhere else when it happened, and would carry that for the rest of his life, which is the arithmetic of that war, and it never balanced for anybody. And Terazuki lay in the dark and nobody knew where. The coordinates in the official record were wrong. They were off by about 20 miles. For 83 years, the ship that carried Raizo Tanaka, the ship that a wooden boat killed, was simply missing, somewhere at the bottom of a stretch of water that the sailors of both navies had named Iron Bottom Sound because of how many ships were already down there. On the 10th of July, in the year 2025, a research vessel found her. She is lying deep, in the dark, in the cold. Her bow has collapsed in on itself. Much of what stood above her deck has been torn away and scattered across the sea floor around her. The stern that her own depth charges destroyed is not there in any shape a sailor would recognize. Nothing about her looks like the newest and finest ship in the Imperial Japanese Navy anymore, and nothing about her ever will again. She was the biggest thing out there. That was the entire reason she was chosen. And a man in a wooden boat, who could not see her, who did not know her name, who did not trust the weapon in his hands, aimed at the biggest thing out there and pressed a button.